The hum of the starship's engines echoed through the cramped cockpit. Captain Isla Trask sat in the pilot's seat, tapping her fingers on the console, her gaze fixed on the holographic star map that floated before her. The galaxy stretched out, an endless expanse of stars and planets. Each point of light a potential haven, a future, or a potential disaster. But Isla wasn't looking for any of that today. She was looking for something more personal, something that would put the whole mission in jeopardy if she was wrong. The mission was simple. Or so it seemed when they first received it. The idea was to retrieve a long-lost relic, a piece of an ancient and powerful alien technology said to have been left behind by the vanished progenitor race. A simple job for someone like Isla, who had spent her life navigating the deepest corners of space. Her eyes flicked to the co-pilot's seat where her partner, Lieutenant Derek Reed, was scowling at his own console. Reed was young, too young, according to some, but Isla had always found his energy infectious. He had a way of keeping things light when everything felt heavy. That was exactly what Isla needed right now, considering what they were about to face. "Reed," she called over her shoulder, not breaking her focus on the holographic map. "What's the situation on the surface?" Reed didn't immediately respond, his gaze darting across several readouts, his fingers flying over controls. "I've been running scans on the planet's surface, Cap. Something's off." He turned in his seat, his face creased with concern. "The signal we're tracking, it's weak, like the relic's not where it's supposed to be." And, he continued, leaning forward, his voice low and filled with urgency, "there's something alive down there." Isla raised an eyebrow, turning to meet his gaze. "Alive? I thought this was a dead planet. No signs of life on any scans." "Yeah, that's what the data said. But I'm not picking up a biosignature in the traditional sense. It's different. Could be some kind of synthetic life form, but it's moving in ways I've never seen before." Isla considered this for a moment. They were at the coordinates, every inch of this mission had lined up perfectly, except for this one discrepancy. It was strange, unnerving even. The data had been almost too perfect. A little too perfect. And the progenitors, whatever they had left behind, had never been known for playing fair. "All right," she said, standing up and stretching her arms, "we'll deal with that when we get down there." This mission was supposed to be about relic retrieval, not some weird alien creature. "Plot the course, let's see what's going on." Reed nodded, his fingers tapping at the controls again as Isla settled into her seat. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the only sound being the steady hum of the starship and the distant beeps of machinery. Then, without warning, the ship lurched. A violent tremor shot through the hull, followed by a series of alarms blaring across the cockpit. "Report!" Isla snapped, her pulse quickening. Reed's eyes were wide with shock as he fumbled with his console. "What the hell?" "We've just hit a gravity well, but there's nothing on the charts that explains it." Isla's heart skipped a beat. Gravity wells were dangerous anomalies, unpredictable and nearly impossible to navigate. A sudden gravitational pull could tear a ship apart if not corrected in time. She snapped her fingers in the air, sending commands to her own console. The starship bucked again, throwing her forward against the seat's harness. There was another massive jolt. The walls seemed to bend, and the entire ship groaned like an old man trying to stand. "Hold it steady!" Isla barked, gritting her teeth. Reed's hands flew across his controls, trying to compensate for the unanticipated pull, but it was no use. The ship was already being dragged off course. Before Isla could respond, the cockpit windows flooded with light. The planet below, once a distant orb, was now dangerously close, its massive, barren surface sprawling toward them like the open jaws of some cosmic beast. "Brace for impact!" Isla shouted as she slammed her fist into the manual controls, trying to override the automated system's panicked attempts at landing. But it was no use. The pull was too strong. A final violent shake sent Isla and Reed tumbling forward. There was a flash of blinding light as the ship's shields failed completely, and then the world spun. When the spinning finally stopped, Isla found herself on the floor of the cockpit, her head throbbing and her vision blurry. The ship was tilted at a crazy angle, and the sound of crackling flames filled the air. She could feel the heat on her skin. She groaned and pushed herself up, clutching her head. Reed was still unconscious beside her, his body pinned against the remains of the console. A string of curses escaped her lips. "Reed," she muttered, pulling herself to her feet. She shook him gently. "Reed, wake up." He groaned but didn't stir. With a final push, Isla got him to his feet and dragged him out of the wrecked cockpit. The flames were spreading through the ship, nothing fatal yet, but it wouldn't take long. She had to move, and quickly. "All right, we've got two options," Isla muttered to herself, scanning the interior of the ship. "Find the relic, or get the hell out of here. But I don't think we'll be getting out anytime soon." Reed groaned, finally coming to. Where are we?" Isla shook her head. "We've crashed. We're on the planet. I need you to get to the auxiliary engines." "I'm going to get to the relic." Reed's eyes went wide with panic, but Isla was already moving. She didn't have time to explain. The relic was out there, buried in the ruins of the progenitor outpost, and if she could get to it, if she could find it, maybe, just maybe, there was a way to save their skins. "Cap, wait," Reed called after her, but she was already out of earshot. The harsh sunlight from the planet's twin suns blazed down on the wreckage, and the ground below was jagged and rocky, covered in strange, blackened growths. Isla's boots crunched against the uneven terrain as she moved forward, her thoughts a whirlwind of plans, options, and a growing sense of urgency. But there was something else. Something that gnawed at the back of her mind. Something alive, just beyond the horizon. Isla stopped, eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right here. The day had barely begun when Isla's boots sank into the thick dust of the alien planet. Her heart was pounding, not just from the crash, but from the unsettling realization that nothing about this place felt right. The air tasted heavy with something she couldn't quite place, an electric tension that hummed under the surface. As if the planet itself were waiting for something. Watching. She shook the thought away and focused on the task at hand, the relic. Everything hinged on finding it. Behind her, Reed had managed to get the auxiliary engines online, though the ship was still far from operational. She'd given him the task of getting their communications back up, but her instincts told her that time was running out. The longer they stayed here, the more the odds seemed to slip away from their favor. Her hand rested on the weapon holstered at her side, a last line of defense should anything go wrong. It was a standard-issued blaster, reliable but not flashy, exactly what she needed for a planet where anything could be hiding. The ship's wreckage was barely visible in the distance, the smoke from the fires still curling upward, but the surroundings were eerily silent. There were no sounds of wildlife, no rustling leaves or buzzing insects, just the distant, wind-swept howl of the barren landscape. The progenitor ruins lay ahead, towering against the horizon like forgotten titans, their ancient stone structures half buried in the cracked earth. From the scan they'd received, the relic should be somewhere deep within the ruins. But Isla didn't trust scans anymore. This whole planet reeked of something wrong. The fact that a gravity well had pulled them down here didn't sit well with her, it felt like a trap, and she'd been in enough tight spots to know that nothing on this mission was as simple as it seemed. "Reed, how's the comm relay looking?" she called back over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the silence. His voice crackled through the comm system as static interrupted his words. "Still working on it, Cap. But there's interference. I can barely get a signal through." "Great." Just what she needed, more complications. She took a deep breath and pressed on, her boots kicking up dust as she moved closer to the progenitor structures. The architecture was unlike anything she'd ever seen before. Strange glyphs were etched into the walls, glowing faintly with a soft, blue light, though no obvious source of power seemed to exist. The symbols seemed to pulse in time with the strange hum that vibrated beneath the ground. It was as if the entire planet had its own heartbeat, one that resonated in her chest, sending a wave of unease through her. "Reed," she called again, her voice a little more urgent this time. Stay alert. I don't like the vibe this place is giving off. I hear you, Reed replied. But it's more than just a vibe, Cap. There's something. Before he could finish, a sharp screech split the air, so sudden and jarring that Isla's heart nearly stopped. Her head snapped up, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing. The wind whistled through the ancient ruins, carrying with it an unsettling chill. What was that? Reed's voice was now filled with the same unease she felt. Isla hesitated, her senses on high alert. She felt it, a presence, but not one that could be seen. It lingered in the air, something watching, something waiting. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, a quick flash of movement between the stone pillars. She spun toward it, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. But there was nothing. No sign of movement, no sign of life. Stay low, she whispered under her breath, forcing herself to move slowly. Her instincts told her to run, to find the relic, to get out of here as fast as she could. But something about this place, this planet, was pulling her forward, compelling her to press deeper into the ruins. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way with a deep rumble, and the earth split open. Isla stumbled backward as the jagged crack opened wide, revealing a network of glowing fissures beneath the surface. The sound of stone scraping against stone reverberated through the air, and before she could react, a massive structure, an ancient progenitor lift, rose from the depths. It towered above her, made of a material she couldn't identify, a shifting, liquid-like substance that seemed to warp light around it. The lift opened with a hiss, revealing a narrow doorway leading deep into the heart of the ruins. What in the hell? Reed's voice crackled through the comms. Cap, what's going on down there? Something's moving, Isla muttered to herself, watching the lift as it settled into place with a final, metallic clang. I'm going in. She didn't wait for Reed's response. She didn't have time to. Every instinct screamed at her to enter the lift, to explore what lay within. The relic had to be near, and the strange vibrations emanating from the planet were drawing her in. As she stepped closer, a cold gust of wind rushed out of the lift's entrance, carrying with it a strange scent, sharp, metallic, and almost chemical. Isla paused, her fingers grazing the surface of the doorframe, feeling an odd, tingling sensation pass through her fingertips. The air itself seemed to hum with energy, as though the progenitor technology was alive, reacting to her presence. She hesitated, eyeing the lift once more before stepping inside. The interior was stark and sleek, more reminiscent of a high-tech medical chamber than a spaceship. Smooth, glowing panels lined the walls, and in the center of the room, an object rested on a pedestal, what could only be the relic she had been sent to find. It was a small cube, no larger than her palm, glowing with the same eerie blue light that marked the glyphs on the walls. She approached it cautiously, every muscle in her body tense. The cube seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, as if it were waiting for her. The moment her fingers brushed against its surface, the entire lift jolted. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the walls began to shimmer as though the very fabric of the building were distorting. Reed, get out of the ship now! Isla shouted into the comm, her heart hammering in her chest. This place isn't what it seems. Get here, now! But no reply came. The static was too heavy. A strange, unnatural silence began to fill the air, suffocating everything. Without warning, the lift's walls began to shift, the glowing panels on them flickering and dimming. And then, with a terrible groan, the structure began to collapse. Isla staggered backward, panic surging in her veins as she clutched the relic tightly in her hand. The ground beneath her buckled once more, and before she could react, the lift door slammed shut. The world around her turned dark, and she was plunged into an abyss of uncertainty. The relic was in her hands. But she had no idea how to escape this nightmare. Isla gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly as the world around her spun in disorienting chaos. The sudden shift from light to darkness left her senses reeling. She blinked, trying to clear the haze, but the air was thick with a heavy, electric hum that filled her ears, drowning out any sound except for the pounding of her heart. She stood, the relic clutched tightly in her hand, her only source of clarity in the darkness. Her breath was shallow, but she forced herself to steady it. Panic would do nothing. Focus was what she needed now. Focus, and a plan. The walls of the lift were now an inky black, their once glowing surfaces flickering erratically, casting brief flashes of light across the narrow space. The hum had deepened into a low growl, and the ground beneath her feet shifted again, more violently this time, as if the entire structure was in motion. Isla stumbled forward, her legs unsteady. Every step felt like she was walking through quicksand, and the air tasted thick with the scent of ozone. Her instincts screamed that she needed to get out of here, get out now. But the relic. She couldn't leave without it. As she moved, the walls began to shift, the glowing symbols now completely gone, replaced by dark, pulsing veins of light that seemed to pulse and twitch like the nerves of some immense creature. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a progenitor structure. This wasn't just a ship or ruin. It was alive. The entire place was a vast, biomechanical organism, and it was reacting to her presence. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way, and Isla was thrown forward, her body crashing against the floor as the structure trembled once more. The sensation of being in a living, breathing entity was no longer a theory, it was a terrifying, visceral reality. The entire structure seemed to groan with a low, guttural sound as if it were waking up, shifting and adjusting to something she couldn't see. Her mind raced. She had to move. She had to think. She knew what this was. The progenitors had once been rumored to experiment with blending organic and mechanical life, creating massive, sentient ships that could bend the laws of physics and survive in the harshest environments. What they had created here was far beyond anything Isla had ever encountered, a massive, living entity that had somehow been dormant for millennia, waiting for something, or someone, to trigger its reawakening. And she had done exactly that. A shrill, high-pitched screech cut through the air, making her ears ring. She didn't have to look to know what it was, something was coming. Something hunting. Isla scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest as the walls of the structure seemed to close in on her. The air thickened, swirling with a strange energy that made her skin crawl. She could feel the presence of something just behind her, something vast and unknowable. Her mind flashed to Reed. She had to get to him. They needed to leave this place before whatever was stalking them found them first. She turned on her heel and ran, her legs pumping as she sped through the darkened corridor. The relic burned in her hand, a constant reminder of the mission that had gone horribly wrong. The ship groaned again, and the low rumble deepened into something closer to a growl. Isla's instincts screamed that whatever was out there, whatever was moving in the shadows, was far worse than anything she had imagined. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath her feet once more, harder this time, and the walls of the structure seemed to bend and shift as though they were alive, responding to something beyond her understanding. Isla's breath came in ragged gasps as she skidded to a halt. She couldn't outrun it. Not like this. "Reed," she shouted into the comm, her voice hoarse with panic. "I need you here now. We've got a serious problem." But the static returned, thick and impenetrable. She was on her own. The walls around her began to pulse in time with the deep, resonating growl that was coming from the depths of the structure. The floor beneath her feet buckled again, and a massive, metallic door at the end of the hall slid open with a shriek of grinding gears. There, standing in the entrance, was something she could not believe. A creature, no, a being, emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid, but far from human, its skin a dark, metallic sheen that reflected the erratic light of the structure. Its eyes were vast, like black voids, glowing with an eerie blue light. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in claws that scraped against the ground as it moved. The creature's head cocked to one side, and Isla's pulse quickened. It wasn't a progenitor, but it was something created by them. It wasn't alive in the traditional sense. It was a weapon. A guardian. And it was awake. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Isla's mind raced, her hand tightening around the relic. This was no longer about retrieving some artifact, it was about survival. If she didn't act fast, that thing would tear her apart, and the planet would claim her, just like it had claimed all the others. She reached for her blaster, but a low growl cut through the air before she could pull it free. The creature moved, faster than she could react. It was on her in an instant, its claws swiping through the air with lethal precision. She barely managed to duck in time, the claws grazing her shoulder and sending a shock of pain down her arm. Isla rolled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scrambled to her feet. The creature's eyes fixed on her with a terrifying intensity, its movements smooth and unnatural, like a predator closing in on its prey. There was no time for hesitation. Isla's mind went blank, the adrenaline flooding her veins. She knew only one thing: she had to survive. The creature lunged again, but this time, Isla was ready. She pulled the blaster from her side and fired. The first shot hit its chest, but the creature barely flinched, its metallic skin absorbing the impact. She fired again, this time aiming for the joints, its knees, its elbows. She needed to slow it down. The blaster shots were puny against the creature's armor, but they did the job. With a high-pitched screech, the creature staggered back, its limbs twitching as if responding to the pain. It hissed, and Isla's pulse quickened as it charged again, moving faster than she expected. In a flash, she ducked into a side passage, barely avoiding the creature's claws as it swiped at the air. The narrow passage was a maze, the walls closing in on her as she sprinted, her mind focused entirely on escaping. Behind her, the creature's footsteps thundered, the air vibrating with its pursuit. Isla's mind raced. There had to be an escape route. Some way out. Some way to buy herself enough time. And then she saw it. At the end of the passage was a small, narrow door, its surface cracked and damaged but still functional. If she could get to it, if she could just... A sharp hiss from behind her froze her in her tracks. The creature had caught up. Its glowing eyes burned through the darkness, its claws extending as it moved toward her with terrifying speed. She didn't have time. There was no room to fight. No room to run. But the relic, it was still in her hand. Its soft, pulsing glow seemed to beckon her. Isla took a deep breath, her mind flashing with the memories of every moment that had led to this point. Every step she had taken, every decision. It had all come down to this moment. And in that instant, Isla made a choice. With all the strength she could muster, she hurled the relic toward the door at the end of the passage. The moment it left her hand, the structure seemed to respond, shuddering violently as if it were alive, as if it understood what she had done. The door slid open, revealing a blinding light. And as the creature lunged toward her, Isla dove into the light. The universe tilted. And then, everything went black. Isla's mind flickered in and out of consciousness. One moment, she was weightless, floating in an endless void, and the next, she was jerked back to reality, gasping for air. A strange sense of warmth surrounded her, the air thick with a sharp, metallic scent. Her body felt disoriented, heavy. She blinked, her vision blurry, and for a brief moment, she had no idea where she was, or if she was even alive. And then, like a rising tide, the world slowly sharpened into focus. She was lying on solid ground, her body aching as though it had been through a collision with 100 meteors. The first thing she noticed was the light, the blinding, radiant glow that surrounded her. It wasn't the sterile, artificial kind of light she had seen in the progenitor ruins. No, this was something different. Something ancient. It bathed the space around her in a soft, golden hue. She pushed herself up, her breath still shallow. Her hands trembled as they dug into the ground, and she gasped as the full reality of her situation struck her. The relic. She had thrown it into the unknown, and now, wherever she was, it had brought her here. She was standing in the center of a vast chamber, a space far larger than the progenitor ruins. The architecture, while unmistakably ancient, was far more refined. The walls around her were made of a shimmering material that glowed faintly, pulsating with energy. It was as if the entire room was alive, breathing with a quiet hum that resonated deep within her chest. Every inch of the space seemed to be woven together by light, flowing and shifting like liquid. Isla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She was alone. The creature had not followed her. At least, not that she could see. But the silence was oppressive, and every breath felt like it was drawing her deeper into the unknown. "Reed," she whispered into her comm, but again, all she heard was static. The signal was still down. She had no way to communicate with him, no way to know where he was or if he had made it out of the wreckage. For a moment, she considered calling out to him anyway. But something held her back. Whatever this place was, it felt like it was responding to her. To the relic. The longer she stood there, the more the air seemed to thrum with an energy she couldn't quite understand, as if the very room was waiting for her next move. The relic, the tiny, glowing cube she had carried with her, was nowhere to be seen. In its place, there was a pulsing shape in the center of the room. It was floating in midair, suspended by an unseen force, and its light was the same blue hue that had marked the progenitor glyphs. But this wasn't just a relic anymore. It was something more. It was alive. And it was reacting to her presence. Isla took a cautious step forward, her boots making no sound against the smooth floor. The pulsing shape responded to her movement, its glow intensifying, the light shifting and flickering in response to the energy she brought with her. She felt it, a pull, deep inside of her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the shimmering shape. The moment her skin made contact, the energy surged through her, an overwhelming wave of power and sensation that almost knocked her off her feet. She gasped, her body shuddering as if it were being rewritten from the inside out. A flood of images and sensations rushed through her mind, visions of worlds she had never seen, of beings far older and more advanced than any species in the galaxy, and of a voice, distant and faint, speaking to her in a language she couldn't understand. For an instant, Isla was overwhelmed, her senses pulled into a dizzying vortex of light and sound. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the flood of energy stopped. She staggered back, breathless and shaken. The chamber fell silent once more. Isla wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to steady her breathing. What had just happened? The relic had chosen her. She could feel it in her bones. This was no ordinary artifact. This was something ancient, something far more powerful than she could comprehend. The thought was chilling. What had she awakened? Her fingers tingled, still numb from the intense energy that had passed through her. The voice she had heard, the visions, it felt like a connection to something vast, something beyond the progenitors, beyond anything she had encountered in her career. She was no longer just a scavenger on some backwater planet. She was a part of something much larger. But what? And why her? There was no time to dwell on it. Reed was still out there, somewhere. And despite everything that had happened, Isla knew she couldn't afford to be trapped here. There had to be a way out. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint hum from the far side of the chamber. Isla's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts screamed at her to stay alert. Her hand instinctively went to her side, where her blaster was still holstered. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. In the distance, a figure was emerging from the shadows. At first, Isla thought it was another manifestation of the strange energy in the room. But as the figure stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the creature that had chased her. It wasn't even a progenitor. No. It was Reed. He staggered toward her, his face pale, covered in soot and dust from the wreckage. His clothes were torn, and he was bleeding from several cuts along his arms. But his eyes were wide, frantic, as if he'd seen something that had nearly driven him mad. "Cap," he gasped, his voice barely audible. I thought I'd lost you." Isla ran to him, her heart hammering in her chest. She caught him as he collapsed into her arms, his body trembling. "Reed," she shouted, her voice filled with relief and confusion. "What happened? How did you?" I don't know. I couldn't get the comms working. Then there was a pulse. A massive pulse of energy. It tore through the ship. And his voice cracked. I woke up here. I don't know where we are. Isla shook her head. She had no answers, no explanation for how they had both ended up here. But one thing was certain, the relic, the energy, whatever this place was, it had connected them, brought them together. And now, they had to figure out how to escape before whatever power was awakening around them consumed them both. Listen, Isla said, pulling him upright. I don't know what this place is, but we can't stay here. We have to leave. Reed nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. How? There's no way out, Cap. This place is, he glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. This place is alive. You felt it too, didn't you? The pulse. The way it watches us. Isla felt a chill creep up her spine. She had felt it. The planet, the relic, it was all connected, and whatever this energy was, it had far more control than they realized. There's always a way out, Isla said, her voice steady despite the rising dread. We just have to find it. She stood, pulling Reed to his feet. The room hummed again, but this time, the sound was different, almost welcoming, as if it were acknowledging their presence. The pulsing light grew brighter, and for the first time since they had entered, Isla felt like she understood the energy in the room. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't a weapon. It was a gateway, a path leading somewhere else, somewhere unknown. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized the truth. The relic wasn't just an artifact. It was a key. And the next step was in their hands. Stay close, Isla said, her voice firm as she began walking toward the heart of the chamber. We've only just begun. And as she stepped forward, she knew they were about to enter a new chapter of their journey, one that would stretch beyond the stars and into the heart of something far more ancient and powerful than they could have ever imagined.